Good afternoon, and welcome to the afternoon portion of our parallel sessions. But before we start those, I would ask that each of the young researchers that have been acting as rapporteurs for the morning parallel sessions give a short summary of their findings. So I would start by asking Hanna Lempinen to come up and give us a summary of the sustainability in North and nature resources session number 1.
Not necessarily, no. So, everyone, can you hear me in the back? Probably yes. Thanks, Nicholas. I'm Hanna Lempinen, University of Lapland, Arctic Center, and I'm here to report on the first session that took place here in this room today in the morning, focusing on the sustainability and natural resources thematics here in the context of the North. And if I would have to describe the session as a whole, I would say that the 4 presentations were very different compared to each other, and in my view it also very well highlights the diversity of the issues that are kind of discussed under the themes of sustainability and natural resources. And during the presentations we heard views from different academic disciplines and very different perspectives, ranging from planning to economics and architecture, for example. And again I would say that this very well demonstrates the diversity of the issues that we are dealing with here in the North. And I will now briefly just raise some viewpoints or try to summarize some of the things that I found interesting or fascinating in these presentations that were held here today, and then try to kind of somehow bind this very versatile session into some kind of concluding thoughts that or ideas that I think were shared by many of the people presenting their ideas here today. The first presentation in the session focused on a living natural resource, the reindeer, in the context of East Iceland, and especially with a focus on its economic impact. And here in Iceland, the reindeer is an animal that is being hunted, and but in terms of assessing the economic impacts of the reindeer, it's not enough just to focus on the hunting itself, which was kind of the what I was more or less probably expecting, that this would be the local people hunting the reindeer, but instead it is more of a question of hunting tourism and the associated activities and services that need to be taken into account when these economic impacts are being assessed. And in my view, this whole question demonstrates very well that when impacts of any natural resources are being discussed or assessed, it's not only the direct impacts but also the indirect and induced impacts that need to be taken into account. The second presentation had quite a different focus on sustainable development, sustainability tensions, or tensions between different dimensions of sustainability, and the role of planning in addressing and solving these tensions. And what comes to sustainability and sustainable development, different criteria can and often do contradict. There can be conflicts between the environmental and the social dimension. There can be conflicts or contradictions between the social and economic viewpoints, and also the economic and environmental criteria can and often do contradict. And of course, as the climate here continues to warm up, new concerns will emerge, and the role of planning in forecasting and resolving these tensions will only become more and more crucial. Then the third presentation took us to Greenland and looking at its energy landscapes. And at least in my own field, if we talk about energy landscapes, we kind of implicitly tend to refer to more or less the energy mix of a given country. But here the viewpoint was very different, as the landscapes were understood as kind of hybrids of the cultural and the environmental. And thinking about energy landscapes in the context of Greenland, in my view, more or less became a question of learning from landscapes, in a sense that energy production units would not brutally stand out from their surroundings, but they would somehow blend into the cultural and natural surroundings and become parts of lived communities, in a sense. The fourth one, again, a very different viewpoint to the whole question of resources and sustainability, focused on transport issues here in the Arctic. And As has been mentioned, probably already during today, quite a few times, as the ice recedes, the traffic and transport here in the Arctic are expected to increase. And in this presentation, the whole issue of transport became a lot more than a question of moving things from place A to place B. It's first of all how design and economics come together in designing these transport routes and options and alternatives, but also that it's not just an issue of routes. It's also about where to place the harbors. Then, where harbors are being placed, it will have an influence on the placement of industries and businesses, which will, of course, then create jobs. It will change the ways that lives are being lived there, and of course, it's not just the benefits that are received from this, but also the downsides or the dark sides of transport activities, smuggling, drugs, weapons, people, and so on and so forth. But anyway, this whole question of transport, which at least I myself have tended to think of in very simplistic terms, became a very, very complex issue in its own right. To more or less sum up the session, or how I would read or understand the session in terms of like the title of the session, focusing on sustainability and natural resources, is that issues related to these questions are not simple and straightforward. They're very dependent on place, time, viewpoint, and the resource that we are talking about. In addition, the impacts that any of these have go far beyond the direct ones, and in terms of economic, environmental, social, cultural implications, and so on. And this complexity and diversity highlights the need for both planning as well as interdisciplinary approaches. That's more or less my summary. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Can I ask Michael Luzuk, who was the rapporteur for the session number 2, Policy and Governance in the Arctic, to come up and give his report?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to report session number 2, Policy and Governance in the Arctic. It was very well moderated, and we had 4 interesting presentations and unfortunately short discussions. But fortunately for the audience, we had a chance to learn about different lessons coming from analysis of the challenges and adaptation processes taking place in different parts of the circumpolar north. So firstly we learned from Gestur and Gertar about West Nordic region, consisting of 3 actually quite distinct entities: Iceland, Greenland, and Faroe Islands. And presented study showed that the institutional, economic, social, historical, and cultural dimension of this region is heavily confronted with new challenges, which to some extent make further regional cooperation more difficult, for example, in terms of independence aspiration in Greenland, or in terms of fishery problems, just like recent Mackerel war shows. However, there are also some bright sides and ideas, just like the new idea of applying by West Nordic Council to the Arctic Council to start more close cooperation in coming days. Secondly, thanks to Dimitri, get some insight into North Sea Road present situation and perspectives. Presentation focused on advantages and disadvantages of this road, factors affecting of the dynamics of the traffic, and on future expectations. And during discussion, we try to investigate a little more about economic plans of China, how to use this road more extensively, and about possibilities of development of infrastructure in this road, for example, in terms of search and rescue capabilities. Third presentation done by Johanna was offering a brief overview of the Arctic region as Europe's strategic neighborhood, especially from perspective of its territorial capital of Northern Territories. And this research done in the framework of ITEN project indicates that Arctic, in times of climate change, is both source of opportunities and threats for the European Union. And the last but not least, we learned from Heikki about Arctic dimension of Finnish regional policy, especially in case of Lapland. We learned how this changed during recent years, and how new perspective is rather optimistic about how climate change influenced Lapland. And from this perspective, this change means that Lapland can become a new transport corridor, new information center, or more generally a unique resource for the Finland. And this regional perspective was very interesting, comparing to more nationally oriented or EU dimension of analysis of this part of Europe. To sum up, I would say that we received a lot of information, a lot of good analysis, but a lot of new questions also. So it's a very good starting point for new research, and I think that audience will be very happy to follow these suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Our final rapporteur for the morning was Sigmar Arnesen. He was doing session number 3, Adaptation to Socioeconomic Changes in the Arctic. Sigmar. And I'll thank Sigmar in advance.
Yeah, well, like the other sessions, the presentation made were different from each other in this session about adaptation to socio-economic changes in the Arctic. The first one was about mental health, where the title was Enabling Social Capital in the Arctic. And there we got to hear that there has been a success in enabling social capital in mental health in Iceland, and empowerment in mental health came from the grassroots. Those that were involved, or the patients, they wanted to be acknowledged and heard, and in that matter they talked about human rights. And for those patients, getting work and using their resources changed their lives and helped them greatly, or just to get involved in what they are good in, and which is quite positive for mental health. Of course, there's some more work needed to be done, and the academic system has to be changed in order to value more grassroots work in the academia. The second presentation is titled Grant Writing and Other Transnational Skills in Adaptation Practices. So it's quite interesting to hear that adaptation to climate change has become adaptation to the bureaucratic system. So adaptation procedures are often decided by people that are far away from the problem, and the people facing the problem have to learn to speak the institutional language in order to be able to deal with the adaptation. NGOs and others have lost funding, and they have to spend time looking for proposals and grant writing. And this is therefore, and grant writing is therefore an important factor in the work of the NGOs. But it's hard to understand the system, and local actors have to learn the language in being able to address climate change in their communities. So the communication problem goes both ways, and the governmental institutions, they do not necessarily also understand the problems that come from the communities. So climate adaptation is therefore not only a local activity, it's also dealt with in a bureaucratic system, and which is an underdeveloped component of climate change. The third one is titled Agency as Redefined by Climate Change and the Case of the Arctic. And in that we got to hear about the project, a project which aims to make an effort to simulate the behavior of the actors in the Arctic and to find a methodology to do so. The question is to identify who can do what to adapt to climate change, and their objective is to develop a framework to conceptualize the Arctic as an integrated system. Their aim is to identify stakeholders and their interactions and to model various actors. They have identified 4 periods and made extensive stakeholder analysis, and in that manner they have identified the different roles, power, legitimacy and etc. of the stakeholders. There is also a mention of the Arctic as a socio-ecological system, which is a framework that has some weaknesses and strengths. The final presentation is titled Climate-Induced Community Relocations, Resilience and Adaptation of Alaska Native Communities. So, people in Alaska have been experiencing rapid climate change. Like we heard from Patricia before, that plus 3.5 degrees Celsius has been increasing warmth during the recent years. Sea ice has been declining and thawing of permafrost. And this has caused a growing problem in Alaska, where communities are being exposed to erosion. Now there are 12 communities that are threatened and need to be relocated, and many others face possible threat in the future. A lot of work has been done in order to face the problem, but little support is available. Some communities want to relocate but do not get the proper support from the government, and are therefore still facing the threat of erosion and flooding, and are of course vulnerable to extreme weather conditions. So those communities are kind of refugees for the need to relocate due to natural reasons. There's a need to develop adaptive governance response based in human rights and establish a relocation policy framework and a dynamic adaptive governance response. 4 different presentations. Each and one of them come from their own direction. Interesting to see and learn the topics and the problems that are facing in the adaptation process. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigmar. Are there any immediate reactions or comments to these reports? All right. If not, I'd like to turn it over to the moderator of the next keynote session, Olaf Foss.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and welcome to this second keynote session and the third keynote speech. The theme for today's keynote speech for this session's keynote speech is the certainty of uncertainty, the challenge of planning for a changing climate. It is presented by Jon Naustdalslid. He is a trained political scientist. He has been doing research mostly on local government, on environmental questions, climate research, also a lot of research on the use of knowledge in governance and planning. And in the latest years, he has been much involved in this last issue related to climate change. I can refer, for instance, to an article in International Journal of Sustainable Development and World Ecology from 2011 called Climate Change, the Challenge of Translating Scientific Knowledge into Action. And his theme is related to this paradox that we have a really large body of scientific knowledge on these issues. And relatively speaking, very little political action. So what explains this paradox? I think this has been some of the main questions in Jon's latest research. So how to relate in planning and policy making to this vast body of knowledge. I will try to be a moderator for this session. My name is Olaf Foss. I forgot to say that. I'm a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research. I'm also ESPON contact point for Norway and project manager for ENICON, ESPON ENICON, who is a co-arranger for this conference. Jon has been the Director General at NIBR, Norwegian Institute for Urban Regional Research, for 12 years. So he has both been my colleague and my boss. Yes, I think I give you the floor. You have half an hour, and I think it's fair that you will be allowed to speak for half an hour. Then we have 5-10 minutes for questions.
This one here. This one. Yeah. How do I move this thing? And just use the arrows. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, and dear seminar conference participants, thank you for inviting me also to give this presentation. As Olaf said, during the last years I've been concerned with sort of the relationship between the knowledge we have and also the uncertain knowledge that we have about climate change, and how do we relate to this knowledge? How is this knowledge, can this knowledge be translated into action? First, a couple of words about the framework for what I'm saying, and key issues which I'm not going to discuss. I'm not going to discuss climate change as such. I shall assume that we are in a process of climate change and that it might be going very fast. I'm also assuming that global warming is mainly man-made. I'm not discussing that, even though quite few people do. And it's caused by emission of greenhouse gases, CO2 being the main, most important. And thirdly, that even though the world should succeed in halting the emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which is not very likely actually, as it now looks, the globe will still get warmer and the climate will change. Then how can we respond to this? How is the response to this? And what challenges does it present for planning? One challenge or one response is to call for more knowledge. We have been used to a climate that is fixed, something that we can get knowledge about by looking back. That's the normal climate. The normal climate is a sort of a average of the last 30 years. That is what we usually refer to as climate. And we get knowledge about climate by looking back. The dramatic new thing for planning is that this is now turned around. We are asked to relate to a climate in the future that is not the climate that we have been used to. That's what planners are exposed to. But even more dramatic, we are not asked, or planners and decision makers are not asked to relate to a climate which will be different, but a climate which will be constantly changing. Something that is not stable, but it's something that is rolling all the way. And that is really a dramatic change, which I don't think we reflect enough on. And this is the problem and the challenge that I will use the rest of this talk to reflect on. How has climate change, or more precisely, our knowledge about climate change, caused new challenges for policymakers and planners? What challenges are we confronted with and asked to adapt to? This is not only the climate that is not as it used to be, but also, as I said, which will be changing. And the possible response always the wrong way. And the possible response to this has been to call for more knowledge and more detailed knowledge. Recently, I participated in a team that studied adaptation to climate change in the Oslo region, in the water and wastewater sector. And we were quite surprised, actually, about the openness of this sort of technical sector to climate change. They had a big knowledge about climate change, and they were very open to also inventive and new approaches to how to adapt to climate change. But we also observed a very strong call for more and more detailed knowledge down at the local level. What sort of frequencies of high floods are we expected to meet in the future? What will the sea level rise be in our particular part of the country? What will the weather be in 30 years from now? The constructions, the infrastructure that we construct today is supposed to last for 50 years, 60 years, 100 years. How is it? What guidelines can authorities give us for these very practical things? The hope which has been expressed by politicians as well as the research community is that more knowledge about the climate system, better and more precise knowledge of climate models, and better understanding of the causal links between global temperature and local climate. All this will make planning for adaptation to climate change easier at the local level. I will argue that this is not actually what is going to happen. What we see is that more climate research creates new questions and more uncertainties. The further we move away from the general agreement that we are witnessing a global warming to what will be the climatic effects of this warming, from the global down to the local level, the more uncertainty and the more scientific and political disagreement. To put it differently, the closer we come to policy-relevant knowledge, the less scientific certainty. I think it's time that we start to realize that the most important contribution of climate science or climate research to climate science to planning has not been to make planning easier, but to make planning much more difficult. And at this stage I'm tempted to quote the Bible. I don't use that often, but refer to the preacher who so strikingly put it, in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. So what then, how does this uncertainty look like in more detail, and how can we meet it? I think that the crux of the matter has to do with the fact that the relationship between nature and society is about to change. We are used to thinking about weather and climate as something external to society. Generally knowledge-based environmental management and planning are based on a more or less clear distinction between nature and society. And weather and the climate has belonged to the external natural reality. A natural reality which the natural sciences provide us with knowledge about. Then the social sciences provide us with knowledge about how the planning process works, how measures can be implemented, how people react to planning, and so on. And spaghetti climate change is part of a wider historical distorting of this simple dualistic picture of the articulation of nature and society. The British climate scientist, Mike Holm, has put the basic point very bluntly, saying that there is no longer such a thing as a purely natural weather event. With climate change, it is nature itself that is changing. And I quote Holm a few lines. He says, the planetary system, which yields distinct weather in distinct times, in distinct places, is now a changed system. It is a hybrid system yielding hybrid weather. Whatever the weather outside my window today, whether storm or calm, whether heat wave or cold wave, it is a result of the new co-produced natural cultural system. We may call this new co-produced climate post-natural or a different paradigm or naturalness, but whatever we call it, we cannot return to living with a simply natural climate. If we accept that the climate system has changed into a hybrid system, that it has become some sort of a crossbreed between nature and society, it has far-reaching consequences for all practical planning involving the environment. I shall use the EU's Water Framework Directive as sort of a framework as an example for the more sort of practical challenges that we are met with, taking this as our point of departure. The Water Framework Directive has as its aim to secure good ecological status in all EU freshwaters. The directive is based on the assumption that this good ecological status can be identified as a natural state of water in any location. This is a task for experts, and water management plans should be closely based on scientific knowledge about the ecological conditions in river basins, aiming at securing good ecological status of water. Hence, one can say that water management requires some sort of a baseline to say that this is the yardstick against which water quality in each case can be assessed against. Not saying that it always might reach this yardstick, but it is a guideline. This is the natural water condition. Now, how does this climate change affect such a planning scene? Climate affects water quality in a number of ways. Water temperature, frequency, seriousness of flooding, natural levels of chemicals in the water, water as a habitat for flora and fauna, and so on. For water management, the consequence of what we call, or we have now called a co-produced climate, will be that the baseline for what shall be assumed to be good ecological status gets lost. The natural situation, so-called, will no longer be constant, to be identified by scientists looking back, but it will be a flux, a sort of moving target that is constantly changing, and like climate itself, can hardly be predicted down at the watershed level. This situation has been recognized by the IPCC in its freshwater chapter on the second report. It writes, here quoted from an article summarizing the report, traditionally, it says, it has been conveniently assumed that the natural water source base is constant, and hydrological design rules have been based on the assumption of stationary hydrology, tantamount to the principle that the past is the key to the future. Now the validity of this principle is limited For example, water quality systems might need to be redesigned and to cope with less self-purification in warmer waters, with low oxygen concentrations and less increased turbidity, may increase significantly the costs and challenges of treating water to potable standards. Similarly, the EU's Joint Research Centre, in its report to the European Water Directors in 2005, summarized the same point as follows. Reference conditions, the basis for ecological classification in the Water Framework Directive, are likely to change with climate, and therefore cannot be considered as static. Then, this makes it necessary to look at climate science. In conventional environmental management and planning, we are used to going to the natural sciences so that they can tell us tested truth about nature and also about the climate. It is generally and widespread assumed that modern climate science is such an ordinary natural science. Only that it still needs to be more refined so as to provide us with the same degree of tested knowledge as other natural sciences. I'm saying that this is not the case. During the last 30 years, the scientific study of climate has changed from that of analyzing the physical reality of climate to that of aiming at predicting the development of global temperature and hence of global climate. The insight that the level of CO2 and other chemical substances in the atmosphere may affect global temperature is nothing new. It actually dates at least back to the end of the 19th century, and the Swedish physicist Svante Arrhenius, who pointed out and stated this as a fact by then. What is new is the development of modern climate modeling, thanks to the revolution caused by computer technology. Without this, without the modern computer technology and computing power, it would never have been possible. This is what has changed climate science from analyzing the physical reality of climate to aiming at predicting the development of global temperature and hence of global climate. However, with the insight that climate is susceptible to and increasingly is becoming a product of human interference. It's becoming a sort of hybrid climate. Climate science has also, in a way, developed into a hybrid science. It's across the border from classical natural science to itself becoming some kind of a hybrid, dependent on including both nature and society in its models and in its predictions. Climate science has become, as I said, a hybrid science, a crossbreed of natural and social analysis. Climate science is being confronted with a nature which is a co-product of nature and society, and with the added possibility of active climate engineering. We will, even more clearly than today, climate science might contribute to perforating the borders between nature and society, and we can dimly see the climate science that is not only aims at predicting the climate, but actually aims at constructing the climate. That is what is called geoengineering. However, due to the different logics between the natural sciences and the social sciences, it is not possible to include society in the climate modeling on line with physics and physical variables and physical subsystems. Socioeconomic factors, that is the driver for greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, must be included in other ways. And therefore, in addition to the uncertainty inherited in the complicated climate modeling based on physical science, comes the uncertainty inherent in predicting socio-economic development in the future. As an example, the calculations underlying the Norwegian government's report on adaptation to climate change are made on the basis of 3 alternative scenarios: a low, a middle, and a high alternative of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. The most striking thing to be said about the results of this is that it's a big difference between the alternative outcomes. Depending on choice of scenario for emissions, average annual precipitation increases during this century is expected to vary from 5 to 31%. The higher scenario indicated an increase in precipitation in more than 50% in some areas in the wetter seasons. And the further down towards the local level, the greater the uncertainties. There are the uncertainties that political planners, these are the uncertainties that political planners have to relate to when they ask for what will be the level, the flood level next in 50 years. And the uncertainty cannot be reduced by natural science. They are caused by the fact that socioeconomic development in a 100 years perspective cannot be modeled in a meaningful way by a science that therefore has to include these models in their modeling based on scenarios or what is called storylines. What is not at all very clearly reflected in the climate debate is that predictions about future climate is so heavily dependent on social storytelling as actually is the case. And in addition to the uncertainties caused by the dependence on emission scenarios, today's climate modeling are far from reliable at predicting climate change down at the local level. So we have the uncertainties of the scenarios, the storylines, and the uncertainties related to the models themselves. When it comes to reality of planning, the fundamental contribution of climate science is therefore not to improve the possibility to control nature, but to increase uncertainty and unpredictability. As an example, an attempt to predict the water flow of River Thames based on 2 different climate models, the British model and the Canadian model. Climate models, these 2 climate models yielded contrasting river flow scenarios. Similarly, predictions of monthly precipitation at river basin scale for the same River Thames by 2050, based on 3 different climate models and the A2 scenario, gave us a result that summer precipitation varied from minus 10 to plus 30%, depending on the choice of global climate model. So, how can we adapt to this? Confronted with this kind of reality, it's not easy to plan. If, for example, climate change will lead to increased precipitation, increased washout of nutrients, and hence increased phosphorus levels in lakes, which in turn will lead to eutrophication, incrustation, and reduced drinking water quality. Should this be seen as a change in the natural condition? Because it's actually the nature now that has changed. and hence lead to reclassification so that the increased phosphorus levels becomes its natural consequence is taken as the basis for classifying the water body. In this case, nature, the natural condition of the water body is changing. In such a changing nature, we will in practice lose the scientific yardstick, as I said, for what a good status and society's demands. Political considerations and so on will probably to a large extent take over as determinants for what we consider as good water quality. If climate change leads to improved conditions for some fish species of organisms which usually were not in the water, and perhaps become competitors to existing species, for example, highly valued species like the salmon, for example, in some rivers, what should be the response? Should these new species be seen as representing the natural state of the water body and hence be preserved and protected? Or should the water management plan include measures to fight these intruders? This is highly relevant also on land. Consider the Scandinavian or Norwegian discussion, what should we do with the wild boar coming in from Sweden? Should we keep them out? They are coming because of climate change and the changed nature. The answer is far from obvious, but the time perspective of the water directive planning is probably important. Even though climate change may not be seen to take place, even though it might be seen to take place at an accelerating speed, the planning cycle of river basin management of 6 years is probably too short to actually pick up these changes, and the response will probably be to try and freeze the situation as where we are at the moment, probably. This might actually lead to an artificial water status which is not adapted to the climate that we are confronted with. It may also actually lead to reduced biological diversity, since planning and water management measures may restrict the spreading of new species or the possibility for species to move to other habitats. At the same time as a changing climate eradicates existing species from the habitat. Just to mention one sort of dilemma that this sort of adaptation will meet. Flood walls is another example that I can go over very quickly. We have adapted to present climate when it comes to flooding by building, for example, flood walls. These are based on the existing climate. By looking back, this is the situation that we are used to. In a changing climate, with more extreme weather events and more extreme floods, the result might be that if these flood walls fail, the disaster might even be bigger. So the alternative would have been to adapt land use planning so that we don't plan on these valuable areas which the flood walls now allow us to build on. So what we are to a large extent are doing, or what we might risk, is that our present adaptation to the existing climate end up as maladaptation to a changed climate. So well, that was not there. Yeah, that was. So, how could this how could this be met? One possible approach to water resource management as an alternative to present planning, and taking into consideration the importance of climate change, could be what has been referred to as adaptive management and adaptive planning. This is a planning approach based on insight that the ability to predict future key drivers influencing an ecosystem, as well as ecosystem behavior or response, is inherently limited. Hence, management must be adaptive and include the ability to change management practices based on new experience and insights. Whereas traditional planning regimes are seen as being based on a sort of prediction and control approach, which emphasizes with emphasis on technical solutions, adaptive management represents a shift to a management as learning. When the idea of a stable and predictable climate, for example, the idea of nature as a fixed system, erodes, also the idea that it is possible to predict and control nature becomes difficult to sustain. Environmental and water management will have to relate to a more unpredictable nature, a nature where uncertainty cannot be reduced by improving scientific knowledge alone, but uncertainties will have to be accepted as a reality for planning and included into the planning, the way planning is being done. If the impacts of climate change on water are accepted as a premise for water management and planning under the Water Framework Directive, the main challenge will necessarily be to make society more resilient and capable of handling environmental shocks and unforeseen situations, rather than building more heavy infrastructure to restrict future climate changes and to compensate for or repair the effect of climate change on water quality. One implication of such a shift will be that scientific expertise will get a changed role. Scientific descriptions of the state of nature that today serve as the principle, something undisputable, the undisputable fixed point for planning and management, this will become more ad hoc. This is not to say that science is not important, but that knowledge will become more ad hoc. Hence, the baseline for water planning and management cannot be funded on such a fixed standard. The determination of good water quality will therefore have to be left to some sort, at least to a larger extent, to sort of discussion, if you like, bargaining in the planning process. What shall we accept as the good water quality? What are the risks? What are the possibilities? Hence, the question of stakeholder and public involvement becomes more important and takes on a more crucial role. We can foresee that the question of deciding water quality objectives become more of a tug-of-war between different involved parties, where scientists more take on the role as knowledge providers, more than the providers of undisputable baseline for planning processes. An important task for the study of implementation of the Water Framework Directive in the light of the problematic that I've outlined will be to do research, for example, into how different stakeholder interests maybe have different approaches to how the impact of climate change should be responded to and how such ambiguities are actually handled in the planning process. So, to conclude, I will say that climate science has provided us with solid knowledge that we are heading towards an uncertain climate future with current planning practices, which these practices are poorly equipped to handle. And I have indicated that some kind of more adaptive approach to planning may be one possible response to this challenge, saying that our traditional way of planning by looking back to identify the facts about nature will not longer be tenable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the thought-provoking speech, and also for keeping the time, exactly 30 minutes, I think. We are now 1 minute into the parallel sessions, but I would like to let the audience have an ability to ask questions or take stands to some of the points of Jon's keynote speech. Does anybody? There is a mobile microphone somewhere. Does anybody like to view? A microphone is coming here. Yeah.
I'm Marguerite. I'm a young researcher from McMaster University in Canada. So I was wondering actually about the climate modeling that you talk about. I was wondering if you noticed any politicization of that was kind of that was a result of, in a way, that it was affected by that, any politicization of the science, or if there were other factors. I'm just kind of interested in the causal factors there.
I don't think there is a politicization of the modeling. There are, I'm not quite sure, I think there are about 20 climate models being operated by a number of centers around the world. Some are more well-known than others. And the climate predictions we get, the curves we see in the various presentations usually have a high alternative and a low alternative, and there are some sort of average in the middle. So the facts we get presented from these models is very often based on sort of a middle average of what the various models come out with. In addition, you see, as I said, it is explained, this is also dependent on the scenarios, and the scenarios provide the socio-economic scenarios, storylines, provide the input data into this modeling of the social factors creating the assumed emission of CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's the point I tried to make. I don't think there is a politicization of the modeling or what is going on there, other than, of course, it goes through the IPCC, which have also political representatives, so there is some sort of political bargaining in there. But the politicization, I think, comes when we try to sort of apply this in adaptation, for example, in climate measures. That is when, since there is actually so much uncertainty, it opens up for political discussion and political sort of tug-of-war between various interests of how we should interpret what comes out.
Any more questions? Yes?
Thank you for a very good and clear presentation. My question is about why don't you go all the way to the very end of your reasoning? That is, how long can you maintain the illusion of planning? Adaptive planning strikes me still as something that it's still planning, but that requires resources, time, critical distance. If we go all the way of your reasoning, we will be so preoccupied with immediate reaction, no distance, no time, no money. Will there be planning at the end?
Well, that might be in a way, an academic question. There is still a need to have a system for, call it planning or decision making. And we need to, at the local level, where this uncertainty about the effects of climate change is very unpredictable, actually. There still needs to be decision taken about how shall we manage our water resources. What shall we do with new species, for example, coming into the water? The water quality is probably to keep the water here, but it might be, other sectors might be also, of course, important, but I use the water as an example. And that is also because water is so extremely important. We need to manage water. And what I'm trying to say is that this traditional way where scientists come and tell us this is the natural water quality. In the face of climate change, it is very difficult to uphold this sort of assumption, because water quality and the natural water quality 30, 40 years in the future will probably not be the water quality that we can plan for. So we have to manage this in one way or another. And this sort of collaborative, if you like, adaptive planning to develop models and procedures for this is one way of involving scientists in a new way in sort of tackling this, instead of the old way where the scientists come and tell us, this is the truth about water quality. This is how it is. They should learn us more about what is the dynamic now if the climate gets warm, if we get more precipitation. What are the challenges that we are confronted with? So that is my idea. And adaptive planning is no sort of fixed schema you can put planning in.
Okay, I think I will allow one brief question if there are any. Yes?
Hi, I'm Susan. I'm a PhD researcher at the Aarhus Architecture School. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. It's very relevant to my own work, which is about hybridity in landscapes. And based on that relevance, I wonder if you face a challenge that I've found, which is that some people are quite resistant to the idea of hybridity, of there being no pure nature or pure culture, but it being one system, as you suggest. I find that some conservationists don't like it because the whole notion of there being a pure nature out there, something, pure and wild and worth protecting, is what much conservationism is founded upon. And indeed, with conservation, I've found that some people are just resistant to the idea because it goes against a very much something we're culturally indoctrinated to, that being that there's us and there's nature and there are notions of the sublime and so forth. So really I just wondered if you have come across that in your work too, if there's been political or cultural resistance to some of your assumptions and about hybridity.
Yeah, I think we meet that in very many, not in the work directly, the discussions I've had, but of course this is the ruling assumption in society generally. And what I'm trying to say is not widely accepted in the public debate. In the public debate, it is generally assumed that nature is nature, and the challenge of adaptation to climate change will be to, in a way, keep the effects of climate change out, so that we can continue to live the way we have lived with the same species, be it fish or animal or plants or whatever. There are biologists, I think, who starting to think that it might be problematic, as I said, that one. And the threat to biological diversity is frequently mentioned as a main threat of climate change. And what might be a paradox, and I say that even now I'm not far from a biologist, I think is that one could risk that if one tries to freeze nature like it is, one keeps out movement of species, new species coming in, keeping up a sort of artificial environment for those species which we are used to having here. The result may actually be that adaptation and climate-related policies lead to reduced biological diversity. It might be difficult for me dangerous for me to say this because I have no expertise in this. So it's more sort of a reflection that I make.
Okay, then I think we have to, even if this is a very interesting discussion, I think we have to close the session. Thank you very much, Jon Naustdalslid, for this interesting speech, and thanks to the audience for engaged questions. So now we go to parallel session 4 and 5.
Session here. I want to speak from my
okay, let me see. This is, I think this is
his.
No, I think it's Bianca's actually. Where is
But she is after break, so you don't have to put her name unless you copy.
Oh, it's already in here. We just need to get it. I think we just pull it out. There's no.
Anyway, mine is here, and I want to open it on a stick. I don't want to put it here. If you can help. This one. Yeah, try to open it. No, don't copy it.
Oh, you don't. Oh, I'll just delete it again.
Because I have to delete some pictures there. If I give it to them, I don't want it on the internet until I put copyright issues. That's why I didn't know they were going to put it on the internet, so I have to acknowledge. Yeah, but somebody will find it there now.
Oh, no. It's only this one here.
Yeah, so it's F5.
Should be okay.
Hi, Lára. Yeah. Okay, nice to meet you. We are going to have two speakers, then a break, because you see it says coffee break, and then we have to continue for 1 hour.
Okay.
So I think he will speak now and I will speak now. We have a discussion and we have a break.
Okay, and then you need this. Okay. Yeah. But I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Or something.
Do you want this one? This one is on.
Yeah.
You can use this one.
No, I should put like this or.
Let's see. It's can you hear me? Hello. It's okay. You should probably use this one. No.
Hello.
Yes.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay.
Can you put this on your, or just put it on the? You can put it here if you.
Okay.
All right.
And to move it, I just put this.
Yes.
Okay. And shall we start now, or it's a break?
Who was supposed to be the moderator?
I am the moderator.
Yeah, but so just.
Okay. It's okay. Are you sure you should start now because people are on break? What did they say?
She was started 15 minutes ago.
Can you just ask her if you should start because it's already 3 o'clock?
Yeah, I think we should start now.
Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for staying with us this afternoon. We are going to have a session which deals with legal and political issues and climate change in the Arctic. Is it okay to start? Yeah. And those issues are quite important because in addition to what we discussed in the morning, you can find many linkages to law and politics when you deal with climate change issues. We are going to have 4 speakers, and I'm the moderator and one of those speakers. My name is Natalia Loukacheva. I am the first visiting Nansen Professor of Arctic Studies. And I will speak first, then the second speaker will be His Excellency Anton Vasiliev, who is the senior Arctic official of the Russian Federation. He's ambassador at large, and he represents Russia in the Arctic Council. He has a long list of accomplishments. More specifically, he was senior official of Russia in the Barents Euro-Arctic Council and the chairman of the Committee of Senior Officials of the BERC from 2007 to 2009. He had several postings in Beijing, China. He was deputy director of the Department of Security and Disarmament, head of the Russian delegation to the Joint Compliance and Inspection Commission of the START Treaty. And from 2002 to 2007, he was deputy head of mission of the Russian Federation in Geneva, representing Russia at the Conference on Disarmament. But more specifically, His Excellency is an expert on Arctic issues. So we'll have 2 speakers in panel 1, then we have a break, or we have a discussion and a break, and then I will announce 2 other speakers later. So if you don't mind, I'll start with my presentation, if it's okay with you. I am going to focus on climate change governance in the Arctic and legal issues. And I wanted to start with this slide. I just read it in the Canadian news not that long ago. And it turns out that a camel existed in the Arctic 3.5 million years ago. And there is some archaeological evidence of that. You can see some bones which were found this year in Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic. And I just thought it's an interesting article because it raises the question about the future of the Arctic, maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, and the future of the warming Arctic, because this archaeological evidence shows implications for Arctic climate. It's a historical analog for future warming. So I thought it was quite interesting. And then, of course, there are multiple impacts and links between impacts of climate change and other areas. And if I think about those areas, then legal and political issues come to mind a lot. Well, as many of you are natural scientists here, you sure know that there are some estimates that because of climate change there will be impacts on ocean currents, more specifically in the North Atlantic, because of melting of the Greenlandic ice sheet. There are strong links on ecosystem and biodiversity. There are talks about new Arctic agriculture, well, at least in Greenland, in the southern part of Greenland, it's already happening. There are big implications for health and climate change, and in some places, for instance in the States, the bill was introduced this year dealing specifically with ramifications of climate change on health. And then, of course, there are many, if you can call it climate-induced geopolitical transformations which deal with shipping, navigation, etc., etc. There are strong links between climate change and security, not just national security, but also food security, environmental security, and many other types of security. And then, of course, what happens in the Arctic and Arctic climate change has serious ramifications for the globe. The Arctic is a barometer of climate change. Then we can find linkages between climate change and society, or human development, especially indigenous peoples in the Arctic and elsewhere, and we heard a lot about it in the morning today. Climate change and Arctic governance, different dimensions of that, and more specifically climate change and legal frameworks. So, I'm sure you've seen this before, and I think it's a very nice illustration on how many levels climatic changes in the Arctic have implications for different, not just ecosystem, but different actors in this ecosystem. And we are not talking about just wildlife, but also there are connections with humans and indigenous peoples as well. So, climate change and environment, I just wanted to show you some pictures first. On the first one you can see Oymyakon in Russia. It is considered to be the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. The temperature there could drop till minus 68 degrees Celsius. And then you see Sami person from northern Norway. As climate change has serious implications for traditional livelihood of indigenous peoples, more specifically reindeer herding in Scandinavia, just like one example of that. Then there are many connections with what happens with the climate in the Arctic and biodiversity in the Arctic, and legal questions come to mind because of new invasive species in Arctic waters. Or I don't say that crocodile is going to be one of them. It's a cartoon, but it is a serious legal issue. And in Iceland, as you know, there is a developing situation with mackerel, for instance. So there are also all kind of questions with fisheries, but we'll talk about fisheries in our second panel after the break. And then there is a question of adaptation, not adaptation of local communities, but also adaptation of animals. You can see a polar bear in Novaya Zemlya in Russia who is hunting for birds, and normally polar bears do not do that. And then you see another cartoon which is an indicator of climate change. You see this dialogue or nexus between indigenous person and the polar bear. So adaptation is a big issue. It's a key measure in climate change regime, and it has been recognized in existing legal frameworks. So what is the nexus with law? Does climate change prompt legal developments? Well, it's a good question. In most instances it does not. But what are implications to the Arctic? In other words, does law matter a lot when we deal with climate change? I'm sure that those of you who are legal scholars, you know this framework already, but the key document is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It came into force in 1994. Then there is a Kyoto Protocol to this convention, and the first commitment, as all of you know, is from 2008-2012. So what happens after? Those of you who are involved in climate change negotiations probably know how challenging and complicated those negotiations are. So in December 2012 in Doha there was another meeting where only some industrialized countries have signed up to the second commitment period. If we think about the Arctic states, United States have never been a party to the Kyoto Protocol. Canada withdrew from Kyoto Protocol in 2011, and Russia did not commit to the second period. So in 2011 at the Durban Climate Conference it was negotiated the need to negotiate another protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. But as we all know, very challenging task this is, and so far not so much progress has been done. And then of course, since many of you are natural scientists, you are probably involved in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As such, IPCC, formally it's not a part of climate regime, but it issues reports which substantially influence the climate change regime. And well, the most recent report is expected to be released in September 27th this year. It will be part 1. But if you look at the previous report and if you saw some information about this new report in the press. This time there is more focus on the Arctic, and there is further evidence of dramatic or substantial climate change in the Arctic. So the key principle of climate change regime deals with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is one article in this UN Framework Convention. But there is a general understanding in even existing legal framework that adaptation is the key measure. Before we were talking about mitigation to climate change, now the key word is adaptation, and adaptation should be happening in different levels. I'd like to focus on maybe two examples, and there is a strong link between climate change law and human rights, so climate change and human rights. And it is very relevant not just to the Arctic, but the globe. And I just found this quote from Greenpeace. By 2050, there would be about 200 million climate migrants around the world, including 20 million displaced by rising sea levels and resulting salinity, as well as storm surges and cyclones in Bangladesh alone. And there are some parts of the globe which are expected to be impacted the most. Those are Central, East and West Africa, the Pacific and South Asia. But when we look to the Arctic region, the situation is also well, the situation may vary in some parts, but generally there is a common agreement among legal scholars that what happens in the Arctic is very important, and there are all kinds of human rights issues which come up. Well, one issue is the right to safe and healthy environment, and the second question is it could be framed the right to be called, and this was asked by Sheila Cloutier, who, as many of you may know, was a chair of the Inuit Circumpala Council, and she was even nominated for Nobel Prize for her activities with regards to climate change. And actually one of the outcomes, what Sheila Cloutier was doing with her colleagues, was a petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights seeking relief from violations resulting from global warming caused by acts and emissions of the United States. This petition was submitted in December 2005. And basically, it got a lot of publicity, and it's a long document which deals with all kinds of issues with regards of Inuit rights in the Arctic. It was submitted on behalf of the Inuit of Canada and Alaska, at least some communities in Alaska. But basically the result of this petition was that it took some time for Commission to look at it, and I guess results were not as great as the ICC expected. But nevertheless, there is another petition which was submitted this April to the same commission, and it's called Petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, seeking relief from violations of the rights of Arctic Athabascan peoples resulting from rapid Arctic warming and the melting caused by emissions of black carbon by Canada. And well, the idea for this submission is, again, you can read this long document. It's available online on the website of the Commission. You can also find it. But the idea is that the Athabascan Council hopes that, first of all, they'll draw public or maybe global attention to the issue of black carbon emissions. Well, they make several claims in this petition, but I think one expectation is that there will be some kind of report explaining all facts and applicable legislation and what has to be done to reduce black carbon emissions, which violates rights affirmed in the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. So it still remains to be seen if this petition will succeed, but I think it's a very important initiative by indigenous peoples, and it's an important tactic maybe to lobby and protect their rights and interests. And as you can see, it's very closely connected to this question of climate change. So, to sum up, well, do we have what is climate regime today, or climate legal regime today? Well, it's a set of legal arrangements among UN member states, but is there a proper voice for the Arctic there? And it's a good question because de facto the Arctic states, they represent interests of Arctic communities. But in practice, does it really happen? It's all has to be seen on an individual case study, I guess, because there are different climate change policies within each Arctic state. But generally, climate change regime, legal climate change regime is not designed specifically for the Arctic. But there are some opportunities there. So, Arctic states represent Arctic interests in the climate regime negotiations, but again, it's perhaps very objective or sometimes subjective how they do it, because it depends a lot on the situation, like economic situation in the country or environmental legislation, etc., etc. So there are all kind of controversial questions which probably come up in that. Do they really represent Arctic interests, or is it just because they're Arctic states they happen to represent, or should they represent? And then, of course, Arctic indigenous peoples are very active in lobbying globally climate change issues. And there are many examples. For instance, they influenced the Global 2001 Stockholm Persistent Organic Pollutants Convention, and there are some other examples. And then, of course, the Arctic Council, we have a representative of the Arctic Council talking after me, but it does scientific reports and serious work which basically influences our understanding of climate change policies. And finally, is this regime adequate to meet Arctic-specific interests and in light of Arctic vulnerabilities? Well, in my view, this regime is not that much adequate. It's like a general framework in many instances, but as I said before, I think there are some opportunities which can be perceived on an individual case study of each Arctic state. And if you want to know more about this topic and other topics, you're welcome to download a new book for free. There are some flyers outside. So, thank you. And perhaps now we have the second speaker, His Excellency Anton Vasiliev, and then we open floor for discussion and all your questions.
Okay, hello, distinguished colleagues and friends. It's a pleasure to be here in general in this Northern Research Forum, and it's a pleasure to be here at this particular panel. No slides, just talk, just words. Arctic Council and climate change policies. First of all, a couple of basics that I think all of us know, but it's important to remind it. The Arctic Council is a multilateral, high-level, intergovernmental forum that facilitates cooperation, interaction, and coordination between the 8 Arctic states in 2 basic areas: protection of environment and sustainable development. Although all decisions of the Arctic Council are taken by the 8 member states and by consensus, the indigenous peoples of the North have a unique say in the Council's discussions, as they are represented by the 6 permanent participants, Regional Indigenous Peoples Association. So this is the mechanism that we have, and this is what the Arctic Council is, no more, no less. Although formally the scope of activities of the Council is limited to above 2 mentioned areas, that's the protection of environment and sustainable development, In fact, the Council's projects explicitly or implicitly cover nearly all possible or imaginable areas of life and cooperation in the High North, with one important exclusion of military security. And the Council has already proven many times being a flexible and quite an adaptive institution, capable to widen the horizons in parallel to the changes in big politics, changes in technology, changes in climate, and changes even in the world market. The bulk of the concrete everyday work, everyday project activities undergoes in the Council in the 6 permanent working groups, which are Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, Arctic Contaminants Action Program, Conservation of Flora and Fauna, Protection of Arctic Marine Environment, Emergency Prevention, Preparedness and Response, Sustainable Development Working Group. Recently, a new organizational form of work started to be practiced more widely in the Council. That's the establishment of the task forces and experts groups, which are established for certain particular tasks, most of them beyond the scope of activity of any of the 6 permanent working groups that we have. So, even judging from the names of these working groups, it's crystal clear that the bulk of the Arctic Council activities is directly or indirectly related to climate change. So what has been done, what is being done, and what will be done in the Arctic Council in this respect? By itself, I think you understand that it's an absolutely endless topic. You can talk for hours about that, but we need to focus on something. So what I'm going to do in my brief presentation is to give you a review of the Arctic Council's main projects with relation to climate change, which I have arranged in certain structure. This is what I'm going to give you. This will be only a very brief illustration, which is far from being all-inclusive, and it is just a sketch rather than a picture. So, first of all, the Arctic Council is, in a way, a pioneer of research and analysis of the climate change per se, climate change in the Arctic. The first step major step taken here, was the famous 2004 ACIA, Arctic Climate Change Impact Assessment, which was a comprehensive study of the root causes, mechanisms, and consequences of climate change. This, indeed, a landmark study, has drawn wide attention in the world to the problem and to the Arctic in general. Let me just remind you the 10 basic findings of that report. Simple but important. 1. The Arctic climate is now warming rapidly and much larger changes are projected. 2. Arctic warming and its consequences have worldwide implications. 3. Arctic vegetation zones are projected to shift, bringing wide-ranging impact. 4. Animal species diversity, ranges, and distribution will change. 5. Many coastal communities and facilities face increasing exposures to storms. 6. Reduced sea ice is very likely to increase marine transport and access to resources. 7. Thawing ground will disrupt transportation, buildings, and other infrastructure. 8. Indigenous communities are facing major economic and cultural impacts. 9. Elevated ultraviolet radiation levels will affect people, plants, and animals. 10. Multiple influences interact to cause impacts to people and ecosystem. Now, 10 years after this landmark project, We are still building all on these findings in our further analysis and practical recommendations and actions. Secondly, what the Arctic Council is doing specific studies on the sources and root causes and some particular aspects of the climate change. For example, in 2011, the Arctic Council has delivered a report on the trends in the Arctic cryosphere, SWIPA, snow, ice, water, and permafrost in the Arctic. Important by itself, this study came to a couple of important conclusions. For example, the conclusion that since the times of the Arctic climate exchange impact assessment, the actual thawing of ice and other trends in the Arctic went faster, much faster than the boldest scenarios made before. The authors have predicted that it looks highly probable that once in summertime we can have a totally ice-free Arctic Ocean already in this century. And there is a high probability that for the first time this can happen for a brief period of time in the coming 30 to 40 years. Those who had the chance to sail across the Arctic in summertime, and I'm among this happy few, can simply testify to the good grounds of these conclusions. I remember that in August 2011, we had a meeting of senior representatives of the Arctic Council on board the Yamal icebreaker, and we had in the middle of August, and we had a trip from Varandei in the Barents Sea to Tiksi, and we didn't meet a single ice, a single piece of ice on our way, neither in the Kara Sea and the Laptev Sea. And for the purpose of demonstrating that the icebreaker is capable of breaking ice, we had to turn our course and go to the north, and we found the ice only on the 81st somewhere between the 80th and the 81st degree of the northern latitude. That was really a very strong impression that we all have carried from that particular trip. Another spectacular conclusion of this report, SWIPAS, is that continuation of the latest tendencies in the melting of Greenland ice sheet could bring about the rise of the sea level by the end of the century by 0.6-1.5 meters, with all the possible consequences written about in the media and all you can imagine. Countries disappearing, New York, Shanghai flooding, etc., etc. Another point of activity, sphere of activity done by the Arctic Council is doing research into short-lived climate forces. And quite some work has been done already, so we understand better what is the impact of black carbon, methane, and tropospheric ozone to climate change. And now we understand that why they are important climate change factors in addition to the most important, basic, well-known greenhouse gases. But still some work needs to be done here. And part of the instruments to help these and other reports being done within the Arctic Council framework is another project which is called SAO, Sustaining Arctic Observation Networks. That's a project aimed at strengthening the cooperation between the observation stations and meteorological stations of our countries scattered around the Arctic in order to have the data got from them in a systematic and stable way. The third field of activity of the Arctic Council here related to the climate change is that the Arctic, connected with the fact that the Arctic Council actively and consistently addresses the consequences of the climate change, or so to speak, the consequences of the consequences, that is, opportunities and challenges coming from climate change. And this relates to exploration of oil and gas. It relates to perspectives of the Arctic shipping, conservation of environment, prevention and response to emergencies, helping to those who live in the Arctic, including indigenous peoples, helping to adapt to changes and, if possible, to mitigate them, and changes in the Arctic biodiversity. In 2007, a big fundamental study called Arctic Offshore Oil and Gas Guidelines was prepared with some interesting insights and recommendations for oil and gas offshore activities. Another step in oil and gas activities, understanding and in preparing the guidelines and recommendations in this field was the very good fundamental study released by the Arctic in 2009 that was called Oil and Gas Assessment. In 2011, another Arctic Council project was prepared that was famous AMSA, Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. That was a first of a kind solid thorough analysis of the consequences of the climate change in the Arctic seas. And the implementation of political recommendations of this report of AMSA is now carefully monitored by the Arctic Council working groups. One interesting project which I think have very clear practical value was named BOHASA. That's bird speak abbreviation for behavior of oil and hazardous substances in the Arctic conditions. Going to biodiversity, in the Arctic Council we have established an important tool of monitoring trends in biodiversity, which is a result of climate change. It's called CBMP, Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. And the basic program, which we have just finished, it took 4 or 6 years to prepare, was the report called Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, which provides the first description of the current state of Arctic ecosystems and biodiversity. It also creates a baseline for use in global and regional assessments of biodiversity and provides a platform to inform and guide the future Arctic Council work. In 2009, the Arctic Council has adopted a kind of chapeau project, assuring safety and implementation of economic and infrastructural project in the Arctic. And within this hyper project, we've made some particular and important steps forward. In 2011, we have ended the negotiations and signed an agreement on cooperation on aviation and maritime search and rescue in the Arctic. This agreement will significantly increase the promptness and effectiveness of help to persons in distress in the Arctic. This year, this May, in Kiruna, during the ministerial meeting, we have signed the second legally binding pan-Arctic document, the Agreement on Cooperation and Preparedness and Response to Marine Oil Pollution in the Arctic. It will also increase promptness and effectiveness of fighting oil spills in the Arctic. In parallel, we have worked on the problem of prevention of oil spills, and this May, the EPPR working group, Emergency Prevention Working Group, has tabled a well-funded report on recommended practices in oil spills prevention. Acidification of the Arctic Ocean, it was the topic mentioned today many times, but it's really a very, very fascinating topic, and for those who do not understand I can simply say that I myself, when I got into the sense of what we are talking about, I realized that this is really a very, very important scientific subject, because we are talking about raising the contents of acid in the Arctic Ocean, which dilutes calcium of bones, of which many living species live in the ocean, with very, very long and serious consequences to food chains and to living conditions in the Arctic, and to bioresources of the Arctic. Another example is 2013 report of the expert group on ecosystem-based management. We started thinking how to deal with all this climate change challenges. And one of that was the first outcome of this working group, and the final report of that provided a series of recommendations, including policy commitment, a definition of what the ecosystem-based management is, and a set of principles of ecosystem-based management tailored to the Arctic, with a set of high priority activities that will advance ecosystem-based management in the Arctic Council. We've started and only made a preliminary intermediary report with Arctic Resilience Report. It's another huge, mega project with the purpose to identify the potential of shocks and large shifts in ecosystem services that affect human well-being in the Arctic, that analyze how different drivers of change interact in ways that affect the ability to withstand shocks, and evaluate strategies for adaptation and transformation in the face of rapid change. Another project is an adaptation action for a changing Arctic, AACA. Again, a mega project. At the Arctic Council Deputy Minister meeting in Stockholm in May 2012, this project was adopted as the Arctic Council project, and it has three components. A synthesis of existing climate change adaptation reports. B, a compilation of existing adaptation efforts oriented to identifying practical solutions. And C, work to develop integrated frameworks and models to improve climate change predictions and other relevant drivers of change in the Arctic. And finally, a few words on the plans of the Arctic Council for the period of its Canadian chairmanship, which has just started and will last till spring 2015. In general, we are, in the Arctic Council, we are very, very ambitious, and we expect further intensification of our cooperation. All in all, we have made a calculation now, and all in all, we have 93 projects in the Arctic Council's pipeline. So just to mention a couple which are related to climate change, these are new task forces. And task force, by the way, it's ignored sometimes, but the task force of the Arctic Council is a really very important thing by itself, because the task force is in fact a full-fledged intergovernmental negotiations, not simply just a group of talkers, of doing talking for the sake of talking, but it's really a very responsible, very serious organization firm of our work. So we shall have new task forces, one on prevention of marine oil pollution with a view to maybe coming to certain obligations in this field. One for further action on black carbon and methane, and another one on enhancing scientific cooperation among the Arctic states. We shall continue our endeavors as far as the above-mentioned big mega projects such as adaptation actions for the changing Arctic, Arctic Resilience Report, and ecosystem-based management are concerned. And so the work will go on. And there are numerous other small-scale climate change related projects that are in the pipeline of the Arctic Council as well. To conclude, a final of couple remarks. Climate change, in direct or indirect way, is and will be in the focus of attention of the Arctic Council. The major part of the Arctic Council activity is related to climate change. Most of the undertaken projects have not only scientific but also practical and political value, helping the Arctic states, their peoples and governments to understand better, foresee and withstand serious problems and more effectively use the opportunities coming from climate change. Recommendations of the Arctic Council projects, except for legally binding agreement, are of course not binding. But practical policies of the Arctic Council member states are more and more based on the outcome of and policy recommendations of the Arctic Council projects, and I know it very well from the practice of the Russian Federation. There still is a huge potential of further cooperation among the Arctic Council states in this regard, and the Arctic Council already is on the way to an even more intensive cooperation here. Of course, the Arctic Council elaborations have not only the regional but also have the global dimensions. And further research into climate change might require more intensive cooperation with non-Arctic states, as the climate change in the Arctic has global origins and global consequences. The Arctic Council is not the only international forum where the Arctic climate change problems are addressed, although it plays a leading role here. There are wider international initiatives in this sphere, such was the International Polar Year. And now the world's scientific community is working on a new initiative, which originally was proposed by Russia, to build on the success of the International Polar Year. And that's the initiative of the International Polar Decade, which is now called International Polar Initiative, IPY. And this is a kind of response from my part to a call which I heard today in the morning from distinguished President Grimson. The Arctic Council actively interacts with the UNFCCC International Panel of Experts and generally in the UNFCCC and its implementation regime. And I think that was very, very correctly mentioned in the report by Professor Loukacheva. During the last UNFCCC conferences, and that has been mentioned already, the parties of the Arctic Council spoke with one consolidating voice. So yes, we have a voice of the Arctic, and yes, we know that the voice of the Arctic is heard here. And we made other joint agreed statements on the issues of the conference agenda. The question that was asked by Professor Loukacheva in her presentation is whether the Arctic Council regime is adequate to meet the challenges. I think both yes and no. I think we are doing nearly the most we can within the framework, within the organization that we have, within the resources that we have. The Arctic cooperation within the Arctic Council is really very, very active and very intensive, and we are trying to catch up with the speeding changes in climate change, with the speeding consequences. And of course, it's never late to perfect ourselves, so we do not pretend that this mechanism is perfect. And I think that one of the organizational, maybe political change that could be made here, with a view of the importance of the climate change and consequences and opportunities, is strengthening the Arctic Council itself. So having the Arctic Council as a more rigid, as a more solid, as a more powerful, maybe sometime in the future, full-fledged international organization that will have even more muscles to address the problems of the climate change. And very, very final words. Again, this is a very, very long and endless topic of climate change, and we had a series of very interesting presentation today in the morning already. But I think that you can, if you are interested in that, in the topic I'm talking about, this is what Arctic Council is doing vis-à-vis the climate change. I can relate you to two sources of information on that for further to satisfy your interest and for maybe probably new scientific research. That's the website of the Arctic Council. We have taken strong steps to upgrade the site, and we have established a standing secretariat of the Arctic Council. There's an officer responsible for the website. We're trying to strengthen the secretariats of the working groups who have their own websites and publish all the information there. So please don't just do the obvious. Just look there, and many information you'll find there. And the final thing is that there's one interesting publication we are doing in Russia. It's called the journal Arctic Herald, and it's a journal which is destined to, at least is conceived to be a journal on international Arctic cooperation, written by professionals of international Arctic cooperation and destined for professionals of international Arctic cooperation and those who are seriously interested in the state of affairs in the Arctic. And it's available on the web. The address is very simple, www.arctic-herald.ru. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this comprehensive overview of the Arctic Council initiatives. And now we have time for questions. And maybe I can ask the first question. In your opinion, those numerous reports and scientific studies which are commissioned or done by the Arctic Council, to what extent do they influence national policies on climate change? Maybe you can think of any examples among Arctic states, because there are so many reports, and it would be nice to know if they really influence policy making de facto in those states. Thank you.
Oh yes, does it work? I don't think so. Maybe I use it all of them.
Hello.
Okay, thank you. That's thank you for a good question. And again, the Arctic Council is doing recommendations, and the only thing that has legal value, legally binding force, are two agreements that have been made. So this is one thing, and these two legally binding agreements are to be executed by all member states. And as far as I know, all the Arctic states have made all the domestic procedures to assure the first, that is the search and rescue agreement, to come into force. So it has come into force in the beginning of this year. And now we are working. Russia has made it, the other countries are still making it, on the internal procedures to do the same thing with the second agreement. But this is just a practical thing. In more general sense, I think that the recommendations of the Arctic Council, although they are recommendations, they are more and more listened to domestically. At least this is a case in Russia. And the particular example that you asked, the tangible example for us is that Russia has worked in the working group on ecosystem-based management, and this could be something that that is already present in the legal systems, in the body of laws of some countries or other countries of the Arctic, not in ours. And what I heard from my colleagues from the Ministry of Natural Resources and other ministries, they say that they are looking very carefully at the initial recommendations of this working group in order to incorporate the recommendation into the law, national law of the Russian Federation. So this is simply a particular example. But generally, I think as our cooperation gets more and more intensive and gets more and more practical, I think the voice of the Arctic Council, now our own recommendations, is heard more and more in a practical way back in the capitals.
Thank you so much.
More questions over there?
Yeah, hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, really good. It's a privilege to have someone from your background here as well.
Could you speak louder, please?
Yeah, I'm Michael Laiho from the University of Lapland, and I was just saying it's a privilege to have someone with your background here who can answer these questions. My question is about what do you feel about oil and gas exploration in the Arctic in terms of transparency? And how these companies could go to some efforts to say who is investing in these companies, and whether you think it's such a big issue, or what does the Arctic Council think about this specific thing?
Permafrost. Could you speak again? I didn't understand the question.
Oh, it had nothing to do, sorry, with climate change policies so much, but it had more to do with oil and gas exploration and the Arctic Council's specific position on transparency with these companies that are exploring in the Arctic region.
Well, it's hard to say. Well, I think we try to be as transparent as we can, and once again, there's more and more things reflected on the website of the Arctic Council itself. The Arctic Council has adopted a special strategy on transparency, if you wish, special. It's called communication and outreach strategy, because the purpose of that document was very simple. We are so busy in practical cooperation that sometimes in those who are doing it, there's no time left just to inform the people, the colleagues, about what is being done. That's why we have taken our own decision to be more transparent, to explain what the Arctic Council is doing to everybody. And this is, by the way, one of the major reasons why I'm here. So I'm implementing the decision that we've already taken. But I understand there are ways to make ourselves work better on that, and we should work on that.
Question here, I think.
Thank you. That question is directed to both of the speakers. Do you think that there is going to be more petitions before the Human Rights Commission by other indigenous or permanent participant organizations? And if so, or in general, how does the Arctic Council itself perceive these kinds of petitions, like the Inuit or Athabascan petition?
Yes, I think it's very logical, and the more that we are digging into the substance of the problems and getting to the root cause of the problem, I think we shall more and more actively use the presence of experts, of non-governmental organizations, and particular organizations, whoever there are, understanding, of course, that they should be the real helpers and help us to do that. And I can tell you, just to give you a practical example, I happen to be a chair of the, for example, the second negotiation that we had on cooperation in preparedness and response for oil spills, and we had a very, very strong presence and advice during these negotiations coming from WWF. Very constructive, very strict to the point, and there were some couple of ideas that we the body of the agreement. That is simply one of the example of the trend that is there. Although of course what we are doing is the cooperation between the governments, and this also has to be taken care of. So this is where we are.
The answer to your question is yes, and there are other petitions on other subjects. I was just using examples of climate change related issues, and I think it's a very important avenue for indigenous groups and others to lobby for their rights. Thank you. So, 5 minutes? 15?
Yeah. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question to both of you. As we know, the Arctic Council is a regional body, and you had a long list of activities what the Arctic Council has done dealing with the climate change. And then, Natalia, you had, in your speech, you talk about climate change governance in the Arctic. Okay, we know that climate change impacts can be local, regional, but the phenomenon is very global, universal. And now, when in the Arctic Council you have the biggest economies when the Council accepted new observers and so on, can you imagine that the Arctic Council will give some recommendations dealing with these observer countries, so that what kind of emissions, so that they should decrease emissions, so that of course not legally binding, but recommendations which should be very seriously taken, and so that the Council could put that as a contribution what these new observers can do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is something which is being thought through in the Arctic Council, although we don't have a clear answer of how to make it. But very clearly, many of the problems of the climate change that we address cannot be addressed properly without participation and action from non-Arctic states, such as take whatever you take the biodiversity or emissions of black carbon, whatever. So I think that there will be more cooperation with observers, and I think that the fact that we already have the biggest economies of the world being an observers of the Arctic Council is a good thing, and it's a movement in the right direction. And we shall simply sit and discuss, and we hope that those nations who have become new observers not only to take, but have come also to give, and that should be fair.
Yeah, well, I think there will be more dialogue with outsiders from the Arctic region, because without that it's not possible to deal with climate change. And we know examples of that already, because it's a global issue, it impacts the globe a lot. It's vice versa, it works both ways. But what could they do more? I think we'll see if they could be more stronger in those negotiations. It's a political process as well, so. Okay, well, thank you so much. Now we have a 10-minute break. Please come back at...
Go push down. Just this, there's no...
This one's here, I don't know how it works actually.
Does it work?
Okay, we are going to continue our session, and our next speaker is Bianca Zhang. She has LLM degree in polar law, and she is pursuing 2 more degrees in law of the sea at the University of Tromsø, and master degree in environment and natural resources at the University of Iceland. Her research is focusing on Arctic marine environmental protection, biodiversity, and natural resources conservation. She is affiliated with APEX and the Arctic Institute,
So her topic is legal challenges of applying precautionary and ecosystem approach in the Arctic fishery governance, and she's also the NRF Young Researcher. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Natalia, and good afternoon, dear guests, colleagues, and friends. Today I am glad to be here and present my research on the topic of legal challenges of applying legal challenges of applying precautionary and ecosystem approach in the Arctic fishery governance. It goes without saying how important it has been, the fisheries industry, to the Arctic societies, especially in the case of Iceland and in the case of Arctic cod. The sustainable use of most valuable fish species is crucial to the nation's well-being. However, it is observed by NASA and Arctic Climate Impact Assessment and other reports that the marine Arctic is going through dramatic changes. These changes basically include the rise of temperature and the change of salinity, acidity, and etc. Therefore, there will be a shift of migration patterns and new habitats, and changes in the fishery distribution, and opening of new emerging fishery grounds where there were no commercial fisheries existed before. So the climate change has been worsening the situation of scientific uncertainty regarding fish resources distribution and reproduction, which is the main challenge in the regulating of Arctic fisheries in present and most likely in the future as well. Under these changes, there are some legal gaps to be closed. Traditional fishery conservation measures are usually dealing with single species and single sector approaches. They are rather reactive rather than proactive. There is also very weak obligation or insufficient control in international law for flag states fishing on the high seas. In dealing with scientific uncertainties, precautionary approach and ecosystem approach has been emerging as a widely and increasingly accepted basic principle in environmental law and natural resources conservation. The precautionary approach is believed to have originated from the Europe's effort to protect North Sea under the global climate change in the 1970s. It has further developed in the contracting of Antarctic Treaty System. And the most commonly cited definition of this approach can be found in the Real Declaration from the Earth Summit in 1992. In applying this approach, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. In different definitions of precautionary approach that deal with different matters, the level of required precaution is vary greatly. For example, in the Real Declaration, threats of serious or irreversible damage is the triggering threshold for precautionary measures. While in the U.S. wingspread statement in 1998, threats of harm is enough to trigger precautionary measures. Another definition from the OSPAR Convention, only reasonable grounds for concern is enough to trigger this measure, even when there is no conclusive evidence of a causal relationship between the inputs and the effects. Because OSPAR Convention is dealing with marine pollution, so the precautional level is quite high in this convention. So therefore I conclude in the threshold of triggering element of precautionary approach, include the degree of uncertainty, causal link between threat and outcome, and the seriousness of potential consequences. The higher degree of uncertainty, the stronger causal link between threat and outcome, and the more serious potential consequences calls for higher level of precaution. In the case of Arctic fisheries, what kind of precaution we should require and to which extent it is implemented will be talked about in the later parts. The precautionary approach, even though as an independent approach itself, is frequently referred as a central part of ecosystem approach. The ecosystem approach can also date back from the contracting of ATS, especially in the 1980 Kamlar Convention. It is also incorporated in UN Convention of Law of the Sea and the Fish Stocks Agreement and various other legal documents. Even though there's no explicit formulation or definition of this approach, it is not difficult to conclude from the provision of various legal documents that it is a holistic approach to environmental protection and living resource conservation, in applying which one should bear in mind the interaction between dependent or associated species belonging to the same ecosystem, and takes into consideration of the interaction of related ecosystems. I concluded this definition. So the two approaches share the same core value, that is to minimize risks on the basis of best scientific information available. Precautionary and ecosystem approach has a very strong relevance to fishery management. In recent years, world fishery have become a market-driven developing sector of the food industry. States have been engaging themselves in investing in modern fishing fleets and processing factories with larger capacity. These are common responses to the growing international demand for fish and fishery products. It is pointed out by the Food and Agriculture Organization that 69% of the world marine fish stocks are either fully or heavily exploited, overexploited, or depleted. And FAO calls for urgent conservation and management measures. Changes in fishery environmental systems are only slowly reversible, difficult to control, not well understood, and subject to changes in environment and human values. The necessity of taking precautionary measures with ecosystem concern lies in fishery conservation, lies in the need for actions taken before it is necessary. To discuss the application of precautionary approach and ecosystem approach, in the Arctic we have to look at the current legal regime of the governing system. We will go from the global level, international legal documents, to regional, sub-regional, multilateral and bilateral level, and finally to national legislation. And we will go from legally binding hard law instruments to non-binding recommendations, declarations, and guidelines, code of conduct. On the global level, the most fundamental two documents governing the ocean is the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and concerning fisheries is the straddling and highly migratory fish stocks agreement, thereafter fish stocks agreement. Both of these two agreements, legal documents, are very general in conserving fishery management. And both of them have mentioned the best scientific evidence available to be based when applying fishery measures. And UNCLOS first pointed out that we have to take into considerations of species associated with or dependent upon harvested species. The Fish Stocks Agreement added to UNCLOS the non-target species, bycatch, and socio-economic conditions, and oceanic and environmental conditions. There is a series of UN resolutions, starting from UN Resolution 16.1.105, called for urgent need for action at all levels to ensure the long-term sustainable use and management of fishery resources through the wide application of the precautionary approach. After this resolution, UN has been issuing a resolution every year, adding more emphasis on this matter. The Food and Agriculture Organization has made significant contribution to the promoting of precautionary and ecosystem approach. It's been promoting these two approach in its code of conduct, guidelines, and joint declaration with Iceland, Norway, namely Reykjavik Declaration on Responsible Fisheries. Moving on to regional level, regional fishery management organizations, the most significant two in the Arctic are the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization and the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission. NAFO has made explicit and clear reference to ecosystem approach, and its members are committed to apply this approach in the contracting area, conserving fishing resources. However, the implementation is slow to occur due to lack of reference points and related harvest control rules. NIBR has also introduced precautionary and ecosystem approach in 1998 and 2005. And this document does not exercise its full competence with regard to the loophole, which is under the regulation between Norway and Russia bilateral agreements. And Arctic Council's work is not as involved as one would expect. Arctic Council working groups, especially PAIM, Protection of Arctic Marine Environment, and CAF, Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, has both mentioned and addressed the importance of applying these two approaches in their reports. CAF also jointly issued a resolution with Conservation of Biodiversity on cooperation on the impact of climate change. However, Arctic Council has not directly dealt with fisheries and is lack of mandate to do so at this moment. Bilateral and sub-regional level, there is an extensive framework of direct cooperation between Arctic states concerning fishery management, and it can be seen as a very good example of regional cooperation in this matter. However, except for the Norwegian-Russian fishery framework, the rest of the bilateral fishery agreements are to apply only single species approach or have no explicit reference to these two approaches. Moving very briefly to national level, we will discuss first the big three. As for Russia, there's a successful example of cooperation with Norway, but the ecosystem-based ocean management has just started, and there's only a slow increase of attention to this matter. In the US, the concept of this approach has been evolving for a couple of decades, and NOAA has been doing a great job in adopting and applying these approaches. Recently, US has enclosed the sea area north of Bering Strait for fisheries as proactive move. In the case of Canada, there's a various recent development in applying these two approaches. And there's an extensive framework of area-based management in the first Ocean Act. And the government of Canada, what is it? Maybe it's a typo. There's a joint management with indigenous people, and it's also a good example of cooperation. And now we move over to the Nordics, and Norway is a good example of successful joint management with neighboring states, because Norway's majority fishing stocks are shared with its neighboring states. In Norwegian domestic law, there is environmental impact assessment. However, it's more dealt with petroleums and rather than fisheries. And there's also area-based management, marine protective areas. In Iceland, there has been a clear and responsible long-term policy going on. And more recently and significantly, it's the Fisheries Management Act from the 1990. There has been a very strict implementation of catch limit system and quota system to ensure the regenerate of the resources. There has been active collaboration with international scientific organizations and active dialogue with stakeholders. And there's also an extensive system of enclosed marine areas. And in Greenland, the fishery management is mostly single species based or single sector based. There is some elements of stakeholder involvement, and there is element of ecosystem based approach, but it's not yet integrated approach. Environmental impact assessment is also in Greenlandic domestic legal system, but it is also not applicable to fisheries. So here I can make my conclusion in the remaining legal challenges in applying precautionary and legal and ecosystem approaches in the Arctic fisheries. First of all, there's a spatial gap. The Arctic large marine ecosystems are not entirely covered by binding legal system that address these two approaches. These large marine ecosystems are defined by PAIM. There are in total 17. Second of all, the Arctic Council's lack of mandate to focus on fisheries conservation and management hopefully will change very fast in the future, I hope. Third, there's national domestic legal system of the Arctic states have very different performances in applying the approaches. The standard and level of implementation varies greatly. This is inevitable. Even though Arctic coastal states have been involved in active cooperation, as we reviewed before, there is little or no interaction with user states or flag states from outside of the Arctic region that might take part in fishery, Arctic fishing in the future when the area opens up. And the last but not least, there's none or little clear state responsibilities in international law to conduct scientific research to find reference points before new emerging fisheries on high seas. In this respect, of course, there's more research needed to be done, and we expect new development in international law. And under current regime of the changing Arctic, nothing is certain but uncertainty. So we have to act before it is too late. And this is my conclusion. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bianca. And our next speaker is Dr. Lára Jóhannsdóttir. She's postdoctoral researcher at the School of Business, University of Iceland, and university lecturer, and also a board member of a pension fund and a member of audit and loan committees. She has 19 years of working experience related to insurance and finance. As a specialist, executive board member and a researcher, she has a PhD in business from School of Business, University of Iceland, MBA in global management with honors from Thunderbird School of Global Management. And her topic is role of insurers when adapting to climate change. And I think the topic is very interesting and practical. And most of us probably do not think about insurance when we consider climatic changes. So the floor is yours.
Katsotaan sitä ehkä tällä hetkellä.
Joo, mä sitä todellakin. Joo, okei. On 6 pönnikä.
Joo, pitäisikö tehdä hiiskua?
Okei. Viltu frekar þá hafa Pétur ekki? Nei, höfundapersóna, er þetta ekki alltaf leið?
Joo. Svona eitthvað bara. Sérst ekki allt.
Það væri bara spurningum að minka þannig allt sem er á klæðum komið inn og hérna.
Ég kann geta þetta síst
En hérna, ég prófaði hérna. Hérna. Svona. Er þetta ekki?
Já, nú ætla að hefða það best. Þetta virkar hérna til að sýta.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? Hello, do you hear me? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to be here today. But in my talk, I will focus on the role of insurers when adapting to climate change, based on climate insurance and policy literature, as well as results from my PhD study on Nordic non-life insurers and their environmental efforts. Okay, we have some problems here. This is the overview of the presentation. I will talk about the role of insurers in the economy, also the IPCC reports on insurance and role of insurers when dealing with climate change. I will talk about the development of climate actions taking place within the insurance industry. Then I will talk about the Nordic insurance case, the case study I did, and barriers for climate-related actions of insurers, and then I will talk about challenges for the insurance in the high north, addressing the Arctic issues as well, briefly. So, starting with, I think it's important because many of you might not know much about the insurance, to talk about defining the insurance. But the insurance is about transferring the risk of loss from one person or group to another in exchange for a premium or payment. It is the insurer's role to protect customers and business transactions by absorbing risk, and it is this risk-sharing role that contributes to economic development, as it provides fundamental conditions for various economic activities to take place. Right insurance coverage can get people or businesses right on track after claims events that could otherwise ruin their financial conditions. Preventing losses and preserving lives is also insurers' role. Insurance is therefore not just a financial instrument, it also has a vital social element as well. And also we should keep in mind when discussing insurance that the insurance sector is one of the biggest sectors in the world, with global insurance premiums of more than $4,600 trillion in 2012. And insurers are also therefore important investors when it comes to climate-friendly solutions. The insurance sector provides protections on different levels, local, nationally, regionally, and globally, and the risk is spread on the same levels. Furthermore, the sector can influence societies based on interactions with various stakeholders and through its products, businesses, and policy stance. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has discussed the role of insurers in several reports. Insurers' role is, for instance, stated in the IPCC TAR report published in 2001, in the fourth assessment report from 2007, and will be discussed in the fifth assessment report due next year or at the end of this year. Additionally, in a special IPCC report, Managing the Risk of Extreme Events and Disasters to Advance Climate Change Adaptation, published last year, it is stated with medium confidence that risk sharing and risk transferring mechanisms at local, national, regional and global scales can increase resilience to climate extremes. The IPCC stated with very high confidence in the 2007 report that climate change adaptation is still limited, although insurance sector is leading in terms of climate adaptation effort of private entities. Others, such as Hoffman and the Lloyd's of London, the insurance syndicate, they state that the insurance industry is still reactive when it comes to climate change. They are responding to regulatory pressure, or that they have not taken catastrophic trends seriously enough. There is pressure on the insurance from international conventions and agreements to act on climate-related issues. Insurers' adaptation role is brought forth in articles in the Kyoto Protocol, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and in the Bali Action Plan adopted at the COP13 in 2007. And these articles all call for insurance solutions, risk management and risk reduction strategies as a way to enhance climate adaptation. Now discussing actions of the insurance sector, climate-related actions. CERES, which leads a U.S. national coalition of investors, environmental organizations and other public interest groups working with companies to address sustainability issues, they have been tracking the development of climate actions of insurers irregularly since 2006. The results are published in a report called From Risk to Opportunity. And as you can see, the number of climate schemes or initiatives recognized have increased in 7 years from less than 200 to almost 1,150. And the number of insurance entities or insurance corporations reporting are also is rising, and also they come from different countries as well. So this has grown considerably in the past 7 years. Now moving into discussing my case study. In the study, I included 16 Nordic non-life insurance companies, and these companies are among the biggest on national or regional scale. The companies, I divided them into two case groups. The islands companies, including companies from Åland, Faroe Islands and Iceland, and these are small and mainly medium-sized companies, but two of them are small. And the mainland companies, including companies from Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden. And these are large companies. And in the process, I interviewed 74 insurance executives and specialists, and I also took part in 2 Nordic insurance climate conferences, one taking place in 2009 and another one in 2012. The second one served as an update on my interview data. I'm not going to go into the methods that I used to write up the interviews or analyze the data. But although the Nordic region is less prone to severe climate impacts than other parts of the world, according to the IPCC, climate events are well known to Nordic insurers, and interviews brought up some old extreme weather events that they mentioned, particularly a storm called Gudrun, but they also brought up some more recent events that had impact on the insurers, and also I received some photos after the interview phase was over. Among the most recent event was a cloudburst in Copenhagen in 2011, where loss estimation of 91,000 individual losses was 4.9 billion Danish crowns, and the numbers from from Denmark correspond to claims notification from 2% of the total population. According to reinsurers, this was the most expensive natural catastrophic event in Europe in 2011. The biggest part of the claims cost was damage to industrial and private buildings, industrial and private chattel, and operating losses. But very recently, Denmark has pressured insurance companies to lower private homeowners' insurance premiums if they implement home improvements for reducing the risks exposure to climate change. In 2011, the Faroe Islands were hit by the storm Beryl, which, according to the insurance annual reports, resulted in more than 4,000 claims and costs of 71.6 million Danish crowns. This might sound a small amount, but the numbers from Faroe Islands claims notification correspond to 8% of the total population. And if I scale this up, to put this into perspective, it would be like in Iceland if the insurance companies here would receive claims notification from around 25,000, and in Sweden it would be around 760,000 claims after one event. And this is just some images from a hailstorm in Finland in the summer of 2010. My study reveals that the biggest Nordic insurance companies are responding to climate-related threats and opportunities in a strategic manner by reducing their own impacts through their core activities and by influencing others to act. As a starting point, the insurers start to focus on internal actions, including development of vision, mission, values and goals, allocating resources, training and skills. This also means to put forth policies, selecting guiding principles and indicators. Focus on their core activities means product innovation with respect to climate change, revision of underwriting and risk management procedures, loss prevention, and claim settlement with the aim of increasing climate resilience. The study did not bring forth investment-related adaptation measures except for some types of early warning systems. Instead, the interviewees mentioned mitigation solutions like investment in windmills and solar cells. So communication and external engagement means that the focus is both on internal and external communication, but also partnership and collaboration with various stakeholders, including authorities. This also means to select and use appropriate disclosure tools such as the Global Reporting Initiative, Carbon Disclosure Project, or reporting actions in accordance to so-called climate-wise principles. Benchmarking is also mentioned as an important factor, and it is a way for the industry to follow up on actions taken and to share best practice examples from within the industry. This is, for instance, done on a regular basis in Nordic insurance climate conferences. However, the findings of the case study show a significant difference between actions taking place within the islands companies versus the mainland companies. In the former group, climate awareness is still very limited and companies inactive, while proactive actions take place within the mainland group. So I also looked at the barriers for actions, and I identified quite many, but I will bring up just to show you examples. One of the barriers is the company size, but there are also issues like lack of leadership, lack of awareness, and negative attitude towards environmental and climate issues, short business horizon, and a factor or theme that emerged from my data is an isolation of the smaller companies from the mainstream discussion taking place within the Nordic insurance sectors, because they do not even show up at the Nordic insurance climate conferences. So I will end up by discussing the road forward, or what I see here for this territory. Climate change requires participation of various stakeholders. It is important not only to focus on heavy industries, there is also need to study the role of other sectors, including sectors that can help fulfill authorities' adaptation policies. It is also important to recognize the leading companies and the companies lagging behind, like I did in this study, and finding ways to enable the lagging companies to act. Different insurance systems is also needs to be studied. For instance, the insurance risk in Sweden is solely covered by private insurers, but public insurance pools are also used to different extents in Denmark, Norway and Iceland to cover climate-related risks. What is also an issue here in Iceland is how fragmented the insurance system is. We have several insurance pools. Besides the private insurers, we have the catastrophic fund, which is called Viðlagatrygging. We have Avalanche pool, Ofanflóðasjóður, and we have emergency relief fund, Bjargráðasjóður. And this means that the debate about climate risk is fragmented, if it exists at all. Only one of the regional companies that I went into included in study mentioned initiative related to the Arctic region, but the company was a part of so-called Arctic tent meeting, which took place alongside the COP15 conference in Copenhagen in 2009. The literature about insurance and the Arctic is almost non-existing, except for a report called Arctic Opening, Opportunity and Risk in the High North, and it was issued by Lloyd's of London in 2012. This report reveals environmental risks and commercial opportunities and operational risks in the Arctic. This includes mineral resources, fisheries, logistics and sailing, and Arctic tourism, activities that will need some degree of insurance coverage. According to the Lloyd's, the potential commercial opportunities in the Arctic may also encourage some companies to take great risk, business risk, operational or political risk. However, comprehensive and rigorous risk management will, the report suggests, be essential for companies seeking to invest in the Arctic. The Lloyd's also discusses Arctic politics in this report, including ownership, control issues and transport risks in the Arctic area, but these issues can have impact on liability issues for insurers, resulting in legal disputes and court cases covering several jurisdictions, adding to further complications of offering insurance solutions in this region. Who is liable and what liability regimes are involved? In most cases, several companies will be involved with various financial capabilities and various insurance coverage. What increases the risk of companies operating in this region, as well as the insurance companies covering the risk, a lack of appropriate infrastructure in the area, surveillance and search and rescue capabilities, meaning the capabilities to deal with disasters. Insurance capacity for energy and maritime activities taking place in the region will not be unlimited, and cover will be offered for risk in returns for appropriate premiums and specified terms and conditions. And I want to conclude by saying my literature review and the research in this area is only a starting point. There is a need for more research in the field of insurance and climate change in the High North. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we have time for questions or any. Yes, Nicholas?
Yeah, do I need a microphone?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Bianca, I have a question for you. What's your, or how do you see the new the import ban on herring and mackerel of the European Union from the Faroe Islands? And I'm asking this because for me that seems to be some kind of an example for how cooperation and precautionary approach or ecosystem approach doesn't really work, and in practice, because the fish stocks are managed by Iceland, European Union, and the Faroe Islands, and so on. And the European Union now says that the Faroe Islands are taking too much fish. And what's your take on this?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, the macro matter has been going on and everybody has been talking about it. It seemed to be a very big issue, of course, for the food resources of the Faroese and for Iceland and for the economic well-being of Iceland and Norway. But in my opinion, who is to decide who's taking too much fish? And there will be a reference point, and there will be a science committee who recommend and to which level you can take how much fish every year. And there's of course a maximum sustainable yield every year. And I don't think it is the three countries and the European Union to blame on each other who take too much fish, and there should be like an individual scientific committee, and in fact there is. So it is not a matter of precautionary and ecosystem approach. It is in my opinion, it's just lack of trust or lack of. It's just a reflection of the lack of scientific data and lack of scientific research on this matter, because we don't know how the migration pattern will change each year. Because the thing for natural resource conservation is we have to wait for the resource to regenerate. For other resources, for example, petroleum mining, the regenerate interval is very long, but for fishery it's really short. Any changes, any small changes happens very rapidly will have a big impact on the resource itself and on how much we can actually harvest without it being depleted. So I think this is a reflection on lack of scientific data, how it affects on failure of managing resources, not vice versa, in my opinion.
Any other questions, comments?
Actually, I have a comment for you. Very interesting lectures from both of you. Excellent. And very interesting approach, the insurance approach. And I was listening to Dmitry Simin in session 2 earlier, and he mentioned that the Northern Sea route, for example, would not be probably a viable option in the near future because of insurance premiums, because of the lack of infrastructure and the search and rescue, and that the insurance premiums would be so high that it won't be a viable option vis-a-vis the Suez Canal, for example, in any near future. Do you agree with that assessment?
I did miss this lecture, so I'm not so don't know exactly what was brought up in this discussion, but I know that because of climate change the insurance premiums are rising, and in some areas people are not able to get insurance for their properties. So that can be issue in some parts of the world.
Nicholas again. One last one maybe.
Yeah, the insurance issue I think is a very interesting one. Is there, probably there is, in Iceland, for example, the employment insurance for fishermen, for example, that they cannot obviously earn money during the heaviest winter time and so on, and because that's the case in Canada. And is there any, with regard to employment insurance, is there anything related to climate change?
No, not to my knowledge. And even when I went to I started with the interview process in the insurance companies in Iceland, and even the high-level executives within the companies, they were not aware of climate change, and they even didn't make the link between insurance and climate change. So this is not even in their insurance coverage yet.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then we'll stop now, and please say thank you to our speakers one more time. And now I assume there will be one more session of reports from young researchers, but perhaps there is more information from organizers on that.
Yeah, just to report.
Are you the reporter?
Yeah.
Here, you will report now?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so we should wait for another group? Okay. Okay.